It is past midnight, deep inside the hull of a Japanese aircraft carrier, and more than 1,000 men are asleep in the dark. They hang in canvas hammocks slung in rows a few inches apart, swaying gently as the ship rolls, packed into steel compartments below the waterline. The air is warm and close, and smells of oil, sweat, rice, and salt. It is, in its way, almost peaceful, a floating city of sleeping men, humming with the sound of the engines. And a few decks beneath those swaying hammocks sit tens of thousands of gallons of aviation gasoline and stacks of bombs and torpedoes. Every man asleep here is resting on top of the two most dangerous things in naval warfare. He knows it too. He has simply learned not to think about it, because you cannot live your whole life bracing for the thing that would kill you in seconds. This is how the crew of a Japanese carrier actually lived, where they slept, how they washed, and what they ate, inside a beautiful, deadly machine built to strike first and never really built to save them. And every ordinary comfort aboard, every humane little ritual, was staged directly on top of the fire that was always waiting. Start with sleep and with the hammock, because it tells you almost everything about where you stood in the ship's world. A fleet carrier carried an enormous crew, well over 1,500 men, closer to 2,000 on the larger ships, and the vast majority of them, the ordinary sailors who ran the boilers, moved the bombs, and worked the hangar, slept in hammocks. Each morning they unhooked them, rolled the bedding tightly inside, lashed them up, and stowed them away, turning their bedroom back into a working and eating space for the day. Each night they slung them again. The canvas wrapped around a sleeping man like a cocoon, holding him as the ship moved, and he learned to sleep through the constant transit of men coming off and going on watch around him. Where you slept was decided entirely by rank. The aviators, the elite, the reason the whole ship existed, had proper cabins and bunks, because they were the expensive, irreplaceable weapon, and the Navy kept them rested and comfortable. The officers had staterooms, and the thousands who actually ran the ship had a numbered patch of steel and a hook for a hammock, deep in the hull, in compartments that grew hotter and more airless the lower you worked. The men who kept the carrier alive slept in its worst air, farthest from the sky. And the rolled hammock had other uses the Navy rarely mentioned. Stowed along the rails, packed tight, it could help stop splinters in battle. It was, in the language of the ship, damage control material. But there was one last use for it, older than any carrier, that no sailor spoke about out loud. Hold on to the hammock. We'll come back to it. Now the washing. And here you meet something that mattered to Japanese sailors more than almost any other comfort: the bath. Japan is a bathing culture. For most Japanese men of that generation, a hot soak at the end of the day was not a luxury, but the very thing that made a day feel finished. And the Navy carried that ritual to sea with it. A warship had bathing facilities, and the bath was treated as a genuine point of morale and discipline, a way for filthy, exhausted men to feel human again. But the sea does not give you fresh water, and a carrier could only make so much of it with its evaporators. So the bath, like everything else, was rationed and ranked. Fresh water was too precious to waste, so much of the washing was done in heated seawater, and access to the tubs ran strictly by rank. On the great ships, commissioned officers could bathe daily. The lowest-ranking sailors might get into the water twice a week, and by the time the bath order worked its way down the hierarchy to them, the water they lowered themselves into was no longer clean. The men who needed it most got it last and got it dirtiest. And they needed it badly because of where they worked. The men lowest in the bath queue were often the same men who spent their watches in the engineering spaces, the boiler and engine rooms deep in the hull, where the heat was staggering, the noise so constant they learned to read each other's lips, and the air thick with oil. They came off watch, soaked through and filthy, climbed up through the ship, and waited their turn for a used bath. The single most restorative ritual on board was doled out in inverse proportion to how hard your body had suffered for the ship. Which brings us to food, and to the one area where the Japanese Navy genuinely tried to take care of its men, for reasons that started with a catastrophe decades before the war. In the 1880s, the Imperial Navy was being crippled from within by a disease called Beriberi, a nutritional collapse that came, though no one understood it at the time, from feeding sailors mountains of polished white rice and almost nothing else. White rice was a symbol of wealth, and the Navy had lured poor recruits with the promise of all they could eat. It was quietly poisoning the fleet, at times laying low a third of all sailors. A naval doctor named Kanehiro Takaki forced through a fix against enormous resistance. Mix barley into the rice. Within a few years, beriberi in the Navy had all but vanished. Out of that reform came a food culture that took feeding sailors seriously, and one dish above all. The Navy adopted curry, thick, mild meat and vegetable curry over rice, borrowed from the British and loaded with exactly the nutrients that kept beriberi away. It was cheap, it fed a whole mess deck, and the men loved it. It became so central to naval life that it was served on a fixed day each week, partly so that sailors losing all sense of time on a long deployment could tell what day it was by the smell of curry from the galley. A carrier's daily meals were built around this barley rice, with miso soup, pickled plums and vegetables, fish, and canned goods. Plain, but decent, and far better than the Army ate. And still, the hierarchy followed you to the table. The ordinary sailors ate at long mess tables set up in the same compartments where their hammocks hung at night. Bed and dining room and living space, all the same square of steel. The officers were served proper meals in a wardroom. The aviators ate best of all. Because here is the quiet truth under all of it. The good food, like the baths, was not simple kindness. It was maintenance. The Navy fed and cleaned these men well because it needed them functioning, sharp, healthy, and calm, inside a machine that asked them to live directly on top of a bomb. And that is the thing that was always sitting underneath every hammock, every bath, every plate of curry. Look again at the geography of their daily life. The ordinary crew slept, washed, and ate deep inside the ship, below the waterline, below the hangars, in a warren of compartments connected to the open sky only by a few ladders and hatches they had memorized, precisely because, in the dark part of the mind, they knew exactly how far they were from daylight. And the carrier they lived inside was, by its very design, a firetrap. Fully enclosed hangars stacked with fueled and armed aircraft, aviation gasoline built into the structure of the ship, ordnance moved and stacked by hand. Everything that made the carrier a magnificent weapon also made it almost impossible to save once fire got inside. At Midway, in June of 1942, the whole thing came due in a single morning. American dive bombers caught 4 Japanese carriers at the worst possible moment. Hangars packed with aircraft being rearmed and refueled, fuel lines run out across the decks, bombs stacked in the open. The bombs that hit did not have to sink those ships by force. They only had to start the fire, and the ships did the rest. Fuel ignited fuel. Bombs cooked off in chains. And the men who died in the greatest numbers were the men deepest in the ship, the engineers in the boiler rooms, the crews in the berthing and mess spaces, the ones whose entire domestic world was at the bottom of a maze that was now filling with fire and smoke above them. The compartments where, hours earlier, they had slung their hammocks and eaten their curry became the compartments they could not climb out of. The daily life and the death were the same rooms. That was the reality no ritual could soften. So come back, at the end, to the hammock. For a sailor of that navy, the hammock was the most personal thing he owned. The cocoon that held him every night of his service, rolled and stowed by his own hands every morning, hung again every dusk. It was his bed, his small square of privacy in a ship of thousands, the one object that was entirely his. And by an old tradition of the sea, it was also the last thing that would ever hold him. When a sailor died aboard and the sea was his only grave, his shipmates would sew him into his own hammock, weight it, and give him to the water, the bed becoming the shroud, the canvas that had cradled him asleep, now carrying him down. Thousands of the men who slept, bathed, and ate inside these carriers ended exactly that way, wrapped in the same cloth they had climbed into every night, or lost so completely inside a burning ship that there was not even that. They lived their ordinary lives, the crowded hammocks, the shared bathwater, the Friday curry, with real warmth and real routine in the belly of a machine that could turn all of it to fire in minutes. And most of them understood the bargain. They slung their hammocks anyway and slept. If this one stayed with you, subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.